The east wing corridor smelled of damp stone and neglect, and it was bolted from the outside. Constance Felton had noted the bolt on her second day at Ashfield Park, a flat iron bar seated in its bracket, with the casual authority of something that had never been questioned. She had told herself then that it was an older wing, perhaps closed for repairs, perhaps sealed for reasons of economy that were not her concern. She had been hired as a companion to the household, not an inquisitor of its architecture. She had told herself this for 6 weeks. On the 43rd morning of her employment, she heard the cough. It came through the paneled wall where the corridor turned, a small, dry sound, repeated twice, followed by a silence too deliberate to be accidental. The kind of silence a child makes when it has learned that sound brings unwanted attention. Constance stood very still, her candle tilted at an angle she did not notice, and listened. The house was not yet awake. The maids would not be on the upper floors for another half-hour. She set the candle on a side table and went to the bolted door, pressed her palm flat against the wood, and said, in a voice pitched just above nothing, "I will not tell anyone you answered." A pause. Then from the other side, very near, "Who are you?" "My name is Constance." "I am new." "I know," the voice said. "I have seen you from the window. You wear gray." She closed her eyes briefly. 9 years old, if the household records were accurate, and he had been counting the colors of strangers' dresses from behind locked glass. She reached into the pocket of her apron and withdrew the roll she had taken from the kitchen, wrapped in linen, and she worked it through the gap at the base of the door, the gap just wide enough if she pressed it flat. She heard him take it. She did not hear him eat, because that was when the footstep fell at the end of the corridor. Aldrich Pembury moved quietly for a man of his size, and he had been the guardian of the Ashford Viscountcy for 11 months, which meant he had also been the administrator of this corridor for 11 months, and the expression he wore when he found Constance crouching on the hall floor was not rage, but something worse. It was patience. The patience of a man who has been managing inconveniences for a very long time. "Miss Felton," he said, "you are not yet required for the morning." "I heard a sound," she said. "I was concerned." "The east wing is closed," he said, "for the young Viscount's health. The dampness aggravates his constitution. You will understand that a woman in your position cannot risk alarming a delicate child." She stood. She smoothed her apron. She met his eyes with a steadiness she did not entirely feel. "Of course, Mr. Pembury. I was not aware the wing was occupied. It was not a challenge. It was simply the most dangerous sentence she had yet spoken in this house." Pembury studied her for the length of 3 heartbeats, and then he said, "The housekeeper will have tasks for you in the morning room. You need not return to this corridor." She did not return to the corridor that morning, because when she turned and walked away, she found that at the foot of the east wing stair, where the passage met the entrance hall, there was a man dismounting from a gray horse in the courtyard below. She saw him through the tall window, dark-haired, 30-odd years old, a navy traveling coat with dust at the hem, and a stillness in the way he came off, the horse that suggested he had not slept much on the road. He handed the reins to a groom without looking at the animal. He was already looking at the house. More precisely, as Constance would understand only later, he was looking at the window of the east wing. She had not known then who Julian Caro was. She would learn soon enough. It had been 3 months since her father died. The debts came first, as debts always do, arriving with the solicitors before the mourning clothes were properly pressed. Constance had stood in the study at Felton Hall, and listened to numbers that added up to nothing she could claim, and she had understood in the particular clear way of someone who has had a week to prepare that the life she had occupied for 24 years was over. There was no brother to inherit, no mother living, no relative of appropriate means. There was a small annuity from her grandmother's estate, and there was her own education, which had been rather better than most, and there was the advertisement she had answered in the Morning Post after a fortnight of weighing alternatives she did not like. The position at Ashfield Park had seemed respectable, a companion to the household of the young Viscount Ashford, whose guardian, Mr. Gashamy. Pembury required someone educated enough to oversee correspondence, and perhaps assist with the boy's instruction. The salary was modest but certain. Constance had accepted it, because certainty was the thing she had lost. She had arrived in October, when the linden trees along the approach were already stripped of their leaves and the great house showed its bones against an iron sky. Ashfield Park was beautiful in the way of neglected things, its proportions still graceful, its stones still pale gold, but the hedges untrimmed, and 2 windows in the east wing dark against the others. She had noted those dark windows, and told herself nothing, because she had not yet learned to mistrust her own silence. Pembury ran the estate with the brisk impersonality of a man who has reorganized numbers on paper until the paper looks tidy. He was not unkind to her. Precisely. He paid her wages on time and made no excessive demands. His wife, Sophronia, was another matter. Lady Sophronia Pembury wore her jewels at the dinner table, with the specificity of a woman who needs them to say what she cannot, and she had taken Constance's measure at the first meeting and found it satisfactory in the way a new piece of furniture is satisfactory, useful and interchangeable. He was presented at dinner that same night, the evening of his arrival, and Julian took his seat at the long table, with the contained authority of a man who did not require the room's permission to occupy it. He was the Earl of Winfield. Constance was told by the housekeeper in a low voice, before supper a neighbor from the estate at Crofts Cross. He had been a friend of the late Lord Ashford. He did not speak much at the table. He answered what was addressed to him, and volunteered nothing. Sophronia directed the conversation toward her niece, Miss Clara Pembury, a handsome young woman with an excellent complexion, and the habit of laughing at her own observations before they were fully formed. Julian listened to Clara with the precise courtesy of a man who is listening to something else entirely. He glanced at Constance once across the candelabra, when Sophronia said, in the warm, confiding tone of a woman sharing a pleasantry with her guest, "Miss Felton is such a convenience to us. Do you know how difficult it is to find a woman of education, willing to accept a merely paid companion's position? One does feel she is wasted on correspondence, but then one cannot be too particular." The words landed with the lightness of something dropped from a height. Clara smiled. Sophronia reached for her wine. Julian said nothing. He was looking at Constance with the expression of a man who has filed something away and will not retrieve it in public. She met the look for just a moment, and then attended to her soup, and her pulse did something it had no business doing. 3 mornings after his arrival, Julian stood at the window of the estate's ground-floor study, where the window looked out over the east parterre. He had been reviewing the estate ledgers which Pembury had surrendered to him with the small performance of a man who had expected to be asked. The numbers were orderly. The numbers were, in fact, too orderly, in the way of accounts that have been arranged, rather than accrued. 3 fields that should have been carrying winter wheat were listed as fallow. The home farm's milk income had declined by 1/3 since the spring of the previous year, with no explanation in the margin. A line item for medical supplies to the East Wing recurred monthly and rose incrementally, but there was no corresponding physician's bill in the household accounts, no name, no date of attendance. Julian had noted each of these things with the quietness of a man who is noting things he should have noted 8 months ago and who is not yet ready to say so aloud. He was not looking at the ledgers when the sound came from the garden. A woman's voice pitched low and steady, reading from a book. He recognized the cadence before he processed the words. He turned, looked out the window, and found nothing to explain the voice in the parterre. No person sitting on the bench, no figure by the rose beds. Then he looked up toward the east wing and saw her. She was standing in the narrow passage between the parterre wall and the east wing's side facade, close to the ground floor grille, and she had a book open in her hands, and she was reading aloud through the iron lattice to someone on the other side. Her gray dress was damp at the hem from the morning grass. Her hair was not quite entirely tamed at the back, one dark pin coming loose at the nape. She was not performing this scene for anyone. She did not know he could see her, and her voice did not pause, did not alter in pitch, did not add the quality of self-consciousness that voices acquire when they suspect they are observed. She read a sentence about the migratory patterns of the European swallow, turned the page with one hand, and a small pale hand appeared at the grill and steadied the book's spine so she could find her place more easily. She said something he could not hear through the glass, and the small hand adjusted its grip, and she read on. Julian stood at the window for a very long time. He did not know why her voice made him think of Edmund. Edmund had been fond of natural history. He had written to Julian about a blackbird's nest outside his dormitory window at Eton. In the second of the two letters, Julian had not answered in time. It was not a useful association. He filed it away in the same place. He filed all of it, the particular compressed drawer in his chest where he kept the things he could not correct. And he went back to the ledgers. He did not close the curtain. He did not look at the ledgers with any real attention for another quarter of an hour. 2 evenings later, he found her in the library copying a letter at Pembury's dictation, and when Pembury left the room, Julian stood at the bookcase for a moment before he said, without looking at her, "How long has the young Viscount been confined to that wing?" She did not look up from the page. "I am not certain he is confined, my lord. Mr. Pembury has said, the dampness is for health reasons. You do not believe the dampness." A pause. "I believe the dampness is real," she said. "I am less certain it is the reason." He moved to stand nearer the table, not close enough to alarm propriety, but close enough that she was aware of his shadow at the edge of her writing. "Do not go to the East Wing alone after dark," he said. "I mean this practically, not punitively." She looked up then, and he found that her eyes were a dark, specific gray, and that they regarded him with a precision he had not expected from someone who spent her evenings copying correspondence. "Are you here to help him, my lord?" she said. He did not answer that. "I am here to look at the ledgers," he said. He was not only there to look at the ledgers, and she knew it, and he knew she knew it, and neither of them said anything further, and the distance between them was the precise distance of two people who have decided not to reach across something before they understand what it is. She went back to the letter, and he went to the window, and she was aware of exactly where he was in the room, without looking at him, the particular quality of a person's presence when they are standing still and paying attention. Her handwriting was neater than usual, which was not because she was trying, and she was aware of that too. The small betrayals the body enacts, without consulting the mind. Over the following days she learned the grammar of his attention. He asked his questions sideways, not with the directness of a man interrogating a witness, but with the economy of someone who already knows most of the answer, and is verifying a remaining detail. He asked whether Henry had received any visitors from outside the estate, whether she had seen the physician Pembury referenced in the accounts, whether the housekeeper had been with the family long. He never asked her to speculate, never asked her to accuse. He collected what she gave him and said nothing in return, and she understood that this was not coldness, but precision, the discipline of a man who has learned not to move until he is certain. He asked her once to show him the east wing door. She took him there in the early afternoon, when the light was good and the household was at its midday rest. He examined the bolt without touching it, studied the gap at the floor, looked at the hinges. He said nothing. She stood behind him and watched the line of his shoulders as he crouched to look at the gap, and she thought, without quite meaning to, that he was the kind of man a difficult situation required, not loud or certain or showy, but capable of very long patience and very swift action when the patience had run its course. She did not say this. He stood, and as he turned he was closer than she had anticipated, the corridor being narrow, and she did not step back and he did not step back, and for a moment they were simply two people standing in a corridor at a distance that had not been planned. His eyes were a specific shade of gray-brown that she had not correctly catalogued until this moment. She was aware of her own breathing. "Greer will be here within the fortnight," he said. His voice was very level. "Good," she said. Hers was too. He stepped back. She did not watch him go, because she was looking at the door, and her pulse was doing something she did not choose to examine. If there is a moment in a story like this one when the thread becomes visible, When the separate strands of an arranged wrong begin to resolve into something that can be pulled, it is often not a dramatic moment at all. Sometimes it is just a woman with a tea caddy and a locked conscience. Mrs. Dace had been the housekeeper at Ashfield Park for 19 years. She had dressed the late Viscount's wounds after a hunting fall in 1807. She had laid out his body in 1820. She had watched 11 months of Pembury's stewardship with the compressed expression of a woman who has learned that speaking too soon accomplishes nothing. She came to Constance one afternoon in the small sitting room that had been assigned to her, sat down with the gravity of a woman preparing for a difficult confession, and placed a folded letter on the table. The paper was fine, the handwriting shaking but precise. The kind of control a man exercises when his hands have become unreliable, but his mind has not. Constance recognized the late Viscount's seal, broken now, the wax cracked along its edge. The letter was addressed to the Earl of Winfield. He wrote it 2 months before he died, the housekeeper said. He gave it to me to send if things grew bad enough. He did not trust the post while Pembury had the household accounts. I waited. She looked at the table. I waited too long. Constance read the letter. It was not long. Thou. It said that the writer was concerned about what would become of Henry if Pembury were left without oversight. It said that Julian had always been the kind of man who saw clearly when he chose to look. It said, in the careful language of a dying man who has very little time for indirection, that Pembury was not cruel, but that Pembury was acquisitive, and that acquisition and a child's welfare are not the same thing. It asked Julian to look in on the boy if anything seemed wrong. She folded it and held it a moment. Then she asked her if Lord Winfield had ever received a copy. The housekeeper was quiet for a moment. He received a letter, she said. 8 months ago I sent a copy through the village post. He never came. Constance took the letter to Julian that evening. She found him in the study, which surprised her because she had expected to wait, and the finding of him immediately, without preparation, meant that she stood in the doorway with the letter in her hand before her expression had decided what it was going to be. He looked up from the desk and went very still. She crossed the room and put the letter on the desk in front of him without speaking. She watched him read it. She watched his jaw set, and she watched something move through his face that was not anger and was not surprise, but was older than both. You received a copy of this, she said. He was silent for several seconds. I did, he said. 8 months ago, and you did not come. He put the letter down. The movement was controlled in the way of a man who has placed himself under significant constraint. I told myself, he said, that a dying man's worries are often larger than their occasion, that Pembury had been vetted by the family's own solicitors, that a child's guardian is not the same as a child's jailer. He paused. I told myself it was not my place. He said this last sentence, with the flatness of a man repeating a phrase he has said to himself many times and has stopped believing. She looked at him across the desk, at the controlled set of his shoulders, and the way his hand lay on the letter without pressing it, and she understood something then. Not the full shape of it, not yet, but the essential quality of what sat behind his silence. This was not indifference. This was a man who had learned to distrust his own instincts, because his instincts had once told him that a situation was not urgent, and he had believed them, and he had been wrong in a way that could not be corrected. She did not ask him about it. It was not, yet, her knowledge to have. He needs sunlight, she said, instead, meaning Henry, and a tutor, and a proper diet, and someone to argue with over his lessons. He told me last week that he has not been outside since June. Julian was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, in a voice that was level in the way of water under ice, I have written to the estate's solicitor, Greer. She nodded once and went back to her work. Pembury announced his intentions on a Tuesday afternoon in the long gallery, where the estate tenants had been assembled for a quarterly meeting of the kind that Pembury managed with the fussy precision of a man who has learned to make procedural machinery serve his own ends. There were 20-odd people in the room, farmers and tradesmen and the clergyman from the village. And Sophronia sat to one side with Clara beside her and Julian against the far wall. standing with his arms at his sides and his face arranged into the expression of polite attention. Constance had come to understand meant he was thinking very hard about something he was not yet ready to say. Pembury announced that the young Viscount's health had reached a point that required specialist treatment, that a distinguished physician in Bath had recommended a change of air, that Henry would be removed to an establishment in Somerset by the end of the month, where his constitution could be properly managed, and that the estate's administration would continue under Pembury's capable oversight in the interval. He said all of this in a measured tone of a man announcing a household convenience, and several of the tenants nodded, because Pembury had been managing their rents for 11 months, and they had not yet found cause to object to anything he had done. Sophronia said, into the general sound of the room, "One is grateful, of course, that the boy has such attentive care. Miss Felton has been concerned, I know, as any merely paid companion might be concerned, but medical decisions are properly left to those with the standing to make them." The room heard this and adjusted its posture accordingly. The small collective recalibration of people who have just been told what the hierarchy expects them to believe. Constance stood at the back of the gallery with her hands folded in front of her, and said nothing. That evening, Julian did not seek her out, and she did not seek him out, and the house settled into the particular silence of a conflict that has not yet announced itself. There was a garden party in the second week of November, which Constance had thought eccentric timing until she understood it was Sophronia's mechanism for displaying Julian's attendance at Ashfield in a social context that made him appear to be a guest rather than an investigator. The lawn had been set up with tables and a small string quartet, and a great deal of late-season hothouse flowers that Constance thought would have better served the estate's accounts if left unpurchased. She was crossing the far end of the lawn, delivering a message to the steward's wife, when she heard Clara's voice from the other side of the rose hedge. "Mamma feels it has gone on long enough," Clara was saying. "The woman has been here 3 months, and she has appointed herself the boy's champion without the slightest authority. Lord Winfield, you must see that a merely paid companion cannot be permitted to dictate the terms of a child's medical care. She is ambitious. It is the only explanation." A pause. Constance stopped walking. "She has no connections," Clara continued. "Her father left debts. She took a companion's position because she had no alternative. Women, in her situation, sometimes persuade themselves that intervention in a wealthy household's affairs will improve their own standing. I do not say she is wicked, only that she is working from motives she will not admit, and that one ought not to be misled by a sympathetic manner." Another pause. Longer this time. She did not hear Julian's response. She was already walking. He found her, 20 minutes later, near the conservatory door, and his face had returned to the particular economy of expression she had learned to read as unresolved, and he said, "Miss Felton, I must speak plainly with you." "Please do," she said. "I cannot act formally without grounds that will withstand Pembury's lawyers. Greer has not yet confirmed the codicil's terms. Until the legal question is settled, any interference on my part risks injuring Henry's interests rather than serving them. I think you understand that I mean this practically." He paused. "I think you should step back from the East Wing matter until Greer arrives." She looked at him. The evening light was going gold behind the conservatory glass, and his face was in shadow, and she was aware of the distance between them in a way that had a specific temperature. "Henry is not sick, my lord," she said. "He is erased, and you know the difference between the two." She did not wait for his response. She went inside. She sat in her small room that night and did not read and did not write, and the candle burned down 2 inches before she accepted that she was not going to sleep. She had done what she could do. She had spoken plainly. She had put the letter in his hands. If he was the man the late Viscount had believed him to be, it would be enough. If he was not, then she was a merely paid companion in a house that did not want her, and Henry was going to Bath, and the thing that was wrong here would go on being wrong with no one left to name it. She thought about Clara's words through the hedge and tried to be fair to them. It was not impossible, she supposed, that a woman in her position might deceive herself about her own motives. that she had arrived at Ashfield with debts and no prospects, and that a story in which she was the champion of a wronged child was a more bearable story than one in which she was simply a woman copying correspondence for a modest wage. She sat with that possibility for a long, uncomfortable moment, and examined it as honestly as she could, the way her father had taught her to examine things she did not want to examine, and she found that it did not hold. Henry was 9 years old, and had been confined to a wing of his own house since June, and had not seen daylight since the summer. That was not a story she had invented. That was a fact she could put her hand on. She had heard him cough through a bolted door. She had seen his hand through a grill, thin as paper, turning the page of a book, because someone was finally reading to him. She could not make herself into the kind of woman who would set that down because a man she had trusted told her it was not her place. She did not, however, know what she was going to do next. The candle burned lower. The house around her was entirely quiet. The specific quiet of a large building at its rest. No footsteps, no voices, the far sound of wind at the north-facing windows. She thought about her father's study in the weeks before he died, the way the room had accumulated silence as the things in it were inventoried and removed. She thought about the morning she had answered the advertisement in the post, sitting at a borrowed writing table in a borrowed room, and the specific feeling of writing her name at the bottom of a letter of application, the sense of staking the last remaining claim. This was what she had left, not the wage. Henry's thin hand at the grill. She blew out the candle and went to bed, and did not sleep well, and in the morning she rose and went about her work and waited for the solicitor. The morning Sir Robert Greer arrived at Ashfield Park. Pembury had arranged a formal assembly in the Great Hall, the kind that announces its own weight. The tenants had been summoned again, along with the senior household staff, and Julian, and Clara, and Sophronia, who wore her rubies, and the expression of a woman who knows the outcome of a proceeding before it has begun. Sir Robert was shown in with the business-like courtesy due a solicitor of established reputation, and Pembury opened the proceedings with a prepared statement about Henry's imminent removal, which had been moved forward by 3 days, a piece of information that none of them had received until the footman came round with the notices that morning. Constance was not in the Great Hall when Pembury began speaking. She was in the East Wing. She had gone at 7:30, when the household was occupied with the preparations. She had lifted the iron bolt herself, the bar heavier than she expected, and cold in her palm, and she had opened the door and walked into the corridor and found it better lit than she had imagined, the windows along the south side admitting a pale November sun that lay in long oblongs across the floor. Henry was at the end of the corridor, at a small table where someone had placed a single chair and a collection of books that were either very old or not the kind of boy reads for pleasure. He was 9 years old, and he was thin, and he had his father's nose and his mother's dark eyes. And when he looked at Constance in the doorway, he said, with the directness of a child who has been alone long enough to have dispensed with social preamble, "Are you taking me downstairs?" "Yes," Constance said, "if you would like to come." He was already on his feet. She brought him down the back stairs, her hand at his shoulder on the narrow steps, and when they came through the servants' passage into the main hall, Henry stopped and looked at the ceiling with the expression of someone inspecting something he had not seen in a long time. The ceiling was nothing notable, plaster and a modest chandelier. He looked at it as though it were the grandest thing he had ever seen. Then he straightened up, and he walked through the double doors into the great hall, and the room went quiet. Pembury saw him first. The color did not leave his face exactly, but something rearranged itself in his expression, the way furniture rearranges in a room when the main wall shifts. Sophronia made a small sound. The tenants turned. Henry Ashford walked to the center of the room, which was the length of about 12 paces, and he stopped, and he said in a voice that was thin with underuse, but entirely clear, "I am told there is a meeting about my estate." The room was entirely still. Sir Robert Greer, who had spent 40 years practicing at the inns and was therefore not easily surprised, said, "And who are you, young man?" "I am Henry Ashford," the boy said. "I am the Viscount. This is my house." Pembury said, "Henry, you are not well. This excitement is harmful to your constitution. You must go back upstairs." And his voice had recovered its management, smooth and patient. But the room had already heard the boy's voice, and the room was performing the small calculations that rooms perform when two stories are presented simultaneously, and one of them is dressed in a too large coat that hung off narrow shoulders. Constance said from the doorway where she had stopped, "Sir Robert, the late Viscount's housekeeper, Mrs. Dace, has been keeping certain documents relevant to the estate's administration. She is prepared to bring them. Now, if you would care to review them," Pembury said. "Miss Felton has no standing in this proceeding." Julian Carew, who had been standing against the far wall with his arms at his sides, took 3 steps forward. He did not look at Pembury. He looked at Constance, and then he looked at Henry, and then he crossed the room to stand at the center of the floor, between Pembury and the boy. He was not a large man, but he occupied space with the particular density of someone who has decided not to move. Pembury said, "My lord, this is a medical and administrative matter. The woman has exceeded her position." Julian said, "Miss Felton speaks for Henry, and I stand with her." The 12 words landed in a room that had been waiting for 12 words since before any of them arrived. Sophronia sat with her fan, arrested at the end of its arc. Clara looked at the floor. 3 of the tenants near the back exchanged a single glance that contained an entire conversation. Sir Robert produced from his case a document that had been waiting in his office for 11 months, a formal codicil to the late Viscount's will, which named Sir Robert as administrative co-supervisor of the estate, alongside a neighboring peer. The peer named was Julian, Earl of Winfield. The codicil was dated 6 weeks before the late Viscount's death. It had been filed properly with the Court of Chancery, which meant it had always been legal, which meant that Pembury's sole administrative authority had never been what Pembury had said it was. Pembury stood very still. He was a man who had organized numbers until they looked tidy, and the document in Sir Robert's hand had just rearranged the numbers into a shape he could not manage. He did not rage. He did not threaten. He said in a voice from which the management had finally gone out, "I believed I was acting in the boy's interest, and perhaps in some small interior country he had never let anyone else enter. He still believed it." The room did not require his belief to change. Sir Robert asked Henry if he would sit down, and Henry sat, and they began to speak about the estate's administration in the practical terms appropriate to a 9-year-old who was being returned to his own house. Constance stepped back from the doorway to let the room complete its business. She had not gone far along the passage before she heard a step behind her. By the time the great hall had finished its work, Henry was installed in the morning room with the estate's survey maps spread across the largest table, his finger running the length of the Ashfield boundary while the housekeeper stood at his elbow and named the fields he was tracing. The housekeeper's face in that hour was the face of a woman who has been holding something back for a very long time and has finally been permitted to set it down. Pembury and Sophronia departed Ashfield Park. 2 days later, their removal managed by Sir Robert, with the procedural exactness of a man who does not require anyone's feelings to cooperate with a legal instrument. Clara went with them, saying nothing that was worth recording. The estate came back into itself slowly, the way a room comes back into its own proportions, when a door that has been shut is finally opened and air moves through it. On the 3rd, evening after the great hall assembly, Constance was in the library, at the desk nearest the window, making a list of books that Henry had requested, and which were not in the Ashfield collection. The fire was up. Outside, the November dark had settled early over the grounds, and the room smelled of candle wax and the particular coal that presses at the edges of old window frames. She heard him before she saw him, a step in the doorway she recognized without needing to look. "He wants a second copy of Gilbert White," she said, "and something called the Philosophical Transactions for 1792. And he says his father read from it to him." Julian came into the room and stood near the fire, and for a moment there was only the sound of it, the small domestic report of the wood settling. He had his hands behind his back, which was his habit when he was deciding something, and he looked at the fire for long enough that she put her pen down. 8 months ago, he said. I received a letter and I filed it in my desk and I told myself I would look into the matter when I had occasion to visit the county. I did not visit. I told myself the boy had a guardian, that the family's own solicitors had approved the arrangement, that it was not my place to interfere in another man's household. He paused. I had a brother. 6 years ago. He wrote me letters from school, and I was managing something I had decided was important, and I did not reply in time, and when I had finally decided it was my place to act, it was too late to act. She said nothing, because nothing was the only thing that would not diminish what he was saying. You did not wait to have a place, he said. You simply occupied one. She was very aware of the space between them, the width of the room, the candle light that reached halfway and no further. Henry needed someone, she said. That seemed sufficient reason. Yes, Julian said. He took 2 steps toward her, not closing the distance entirely, but altering the quality of the room. Constance, he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. He had said it quietly, without ceremony, in the way of a man who has been waiting for the moment when it could be said honestly, and the sound of it in his voice was a specific thing, warm and low, the kind of thing a person's pulse responds to before the mind has finished reasoning about it. She looked up at him. The late Viscount's letter was on the mantel, she realized. The housekeeper had placed it there that morning, unfolded, the late lord's shaking hand visible from across the room. It had been addressed to Julian, and it had asked him to look in on the boy, and he had not, and then he had. And Henry was in the morning room arguing with the housekeeper about whether swallows actually wintered in Africa, or whether Gilbert White had simply been guessing. He wrote to you because he believed you were the kind of man who would come when it mattered, she said. Julian was quiet for a moment. I was late, he said. You came, she said. He was standing near enough now that she could see the specific gray of his eyes in the firelight, the slight tension at the corners that she had spent 2 months reading as coldness, and now understood as the permanent slight vigilance of a man who does not trust himself to miss things anymore. He reached out slowly, and his fingers closed around her hand where it lay on the desk beside the pen. Her breath did something it had no business doing. I would like, he said, carefully, to speak with Sir Robert about certain matters. About the terms of the estate's co-supervision. About whether a woman of considerable good sense and no current household position might be persuaded to take a formal role at Ashfield. He paused. I am speaking of you. She looked at their hands, his over hers, his thumb against the edge of her wrist. The candle on the desk had burned down to its holder. Outside she could hear the faint sound of Henry's voice from the morning room, still arguing. You are asking me to stay, she said. I am, he said, if you are willing. The fire shifted. A log dropped to the grate and sent up a small spray of light. Constance Felton looked at the letter on the mantel. The late Viscount's careful hand, the plea written by a dying man who had known that the people around him would need each other before they knew it themselves. She turned her hand in Julian's and held it. Outside the library windows, the first snow of winter was beginning, falling without any particular drama through the dark, settling on the stone sills of the east wing where the windows were all lit now, every one of them. Henry was still talking. If you have stayed until the end of Constance's story, leave a word in the quiet space below. It matters more than you know.